Hey everyone, RogueGold here. Merry Christmas if you celebrate. Happy holidays to all, and welcome to my dream for The Division 3 Reforged. I'm going to give you the brief version of the context so as not to make this longer than it needs to be. I have a little tradition where I like to try and do a special video on Christmas Day of each year, and this My Dream series is a very special and popular one that I've been doing since the early days of my channel, so here we are. And I think it's important to give a reminder that the point of this series isn't to strictly talk about confirmed future projects, because obviously The Division 3 has not been confirmed, but rather to give my own thoughts and ideas using existing theories and knowledge to pitch what I think would make a pretty kick-ass Division Universe project if it were up to me, in this case talking about The Division 3, because it's been a hot discussion topic as of late. Now, this is in fact not the first Dream for The Division 3 video I've done, but given the last one was well over 2 years ago, I realized I have some new things that I wanted to say, and a lot has happened since the last one I did, providing new information, theories, and context to the greater Division universe. So some of the ideas I'll pitch here have remained, at least in some form, from those previous entries, but much of it will be new ideas infused with some more recent and relevant information, and that I think sound like they'd be pretty darn cool to see. So I will certainly be very curious to hear all of your thoughts about it. Just keep in mind the core principle of this series in this video is about having some pure fun, so don't take things too seriously. I'm going to touch on stuff like story setup, some gameplay mechanics, and a general timeline of when I think the game could and maybe should release, and I will leave timestamps to those different sections down in the description below, so this should be a ton of fun, and without further ado, let's get into it. And let us begin with story. Where, why, and how should the Division 3 be? This aspect of the discussion compared to my previous entries is interesting because in the last Dream for the Division 3 video I did, we were still in year 2, and based on some very vague leaks, we thought that Season 4 was going to end on this major cliffhanger, flag us rogue, and guide us into another expansion for the Division 2, or kick off the Division 3. Obviously that did not happen, both in terms of us not getting an expansion or Division 3, and in the fact that there was no cliffhanger. Things were resolved somewhat anticlimactically, but now, here we are in year 4, 2 additional seasons have come along and progressed the story from there, and we are in a pretty interesting time right now with the game story-wise. So obviously it's impossible for me to know exactly where Division 2 story is heading with year 5 on the way, what ground they might cover, etc., but the general premise I want to pitch here for Division 3 is a big leap forward within the same story threads and ideas that we've been setting up so far in year 4, and even some stuff from earlier in the Division 1 and 2. I want to use all of that to craft what I think would be a really awesome premise for a Division 3 game, so here's the general setup. We entered the Division 3 as rogue agents. Not necessarily by choice, but this is a big theory back in year 2 that Season 4 would end us with us being accused of murdering the president and being flagged rogue. Obviously it wouldn't be under those same circumstances, but I think ending a future Division 2 season, expansion, or whatever with our agents being involved in some fateful event to cause us to lose our authority or be flagged rogue, whatever, would be a fantastic cliffhanger and Division 3 setup. So that's the background, and after being on the run for several months, maybe the prologue takes place out on the road like how Division 1 and 2 had prologues in different locations than the main cities, winter has arrived. The landscape is brutal and we need to hunker down somewhere to survive, except we're being hunted by Natalia Sokolova and Calvin McManus's newly bolstered hunters. So our only option is to disappear, and we realize that that might only be possible within the Black Tusk central city and headquarters. We've always heard about the Black Tusk greater plan. They've always stockpiled resources, technology, captured territory on the eastern seaboard, and I think it would be a really awesome reveal down the line to learn that they've created this dystopian city that they're branding as a safe haven in this post-green poison apocalypse. I'm talking tens of thousands of civilians they're bringing in, warhounds patrolling the streets, those giant drones in the skies, a totally different environment than we saw in the Division 1 and 2. As for what particular city, I think there's a variety of ones they could choose. Boston comes to mind, any northeastern city in the dead of winter, heavily modified with Black Tusk fortifications and tech. That sounds pretty rad to me. And so not only would it be a big aesthetic shift for the franchise, but I think you could have some major gameplay implications as well. If we go into the game as unaffiliated Division agents, there's a lot you can do there. Obviously the Black Tusks and the Hunters would control the city and would be a threat for you to avoid while you try and move around the world undetected through crowds of civilians. But let's say this city is home to other operatives as well. Maybe there's a population of third wave SHD agents that have made their way inside. Maybe the Rogues have some sort of basis set up down in the sewers or the underground. I think it would be fascinating to allow us as the player to interact with all of these different factions at once. Maybe you meet some black market dealers and try to get some stuff done there. Then you have to visit the Rogues lair and accept a quest for some intel. Then you meet with the SHD for other reasons. The idea of not following the president's orders but being in charge of our own agenda sounds really awesome to me. As far as how I envision the general storyline going, obviously the primary threat would be Natalia Sokolova and Calvin McManus. we take them out, and we have a chance at reestablishing our network and proving our innocence from whatever event set us down this path. Obviously, the Black Tusk would be a major faction in the game if it's taking place in their home base of a city. Another faction that I think would be really cool to see, and I actually made a video on this once before, would be this cult-like group who believes in the second coming of the green poison, that it's destined, and their goal is to bring about that. We know that the Black Tusk have been after the antivirals before, so I think a sub-thread of them controlling the cure and like selectively giving it out to the population could be a cool thing to see. There's so much you could do within the concept. But I think the eventual climax of the story would involve us preparing ourselves within the city, sending out a distress signal to Kelso, Manny, Schaefer, assuming he wakes up, and Lewis and his true sons, and find a way to smuggle them into the city for one last massive confrontation. Natalia, Nicomanus, their hunters, and all of the Black Tusk versus all of us. That would be a pretty epic finale. And then, you knew it was coming, I would have it so that the bridge between the campaign and the endgame is the ultimate choice to return to the SHD or go fully rogue. Everyone wants it, you want it, I want it, and I think Division 3 should bring it. This would bring a whole new angle to the game compared to everything you just experienced. Similar to how invasions were a big shakeup in Division 2, depending on which side you pick, you could now go and access those safe houses and hideouts that you visited during the story, and there'd be plenty more diverging stories and content to access. I think it'd be really awesome, and if the campaign ends with the defeat of the Black Tusk, and then perhaps the JTF and Lewis's true sons take control of the city, that would be a pretty poetic closing chapter to the Division trilogy. The first game would be about disaster, catastrophe, and survival, the second game about conflict and rebuilding, and the third game would end with the reclamation of society and hope. Of course, there's plenty of ways to keep the game going for post-launch stuff with troublesome factions and whatnot, but at its core, I think this idea of changing the setting to an actually populated city, having an element of stealth at its core in avoiding detection, allowing you to interact with both SHD and rogue assets, and ultimately tying everything together with those converging factions and storylines, I think it would all be pretty darn cool. And we'll touch on it a bit more later on, but I think all of this could be very much possible given the game would be made next gen only, which basically is a given if the game were to come out anytime after or during like 2025, I would say, but we've talked ad nauseum here on the channel before about the constraints of last-gen technology on the Division 2, how I think a fully next-gen Division title would be exceptional, it could open up so many new possibilities, and Division devs have even spoken before about how the changing landscape of crossplay, cloud storage, and next-gen technology could all help lead toward a future where the Div 1 E3 demo you've been seeing in the background could finally become a reality. And that's absolutely the reality I hope we're heading toward, and that I would envision this Division 3 game encapsulating. So, in talking about that stuff, let's move on over to the more gameplay-focused aspect of this discussion. Now, there are a million different points I could touch on here, things I could delve into: movement, weapons, skills, gear, endgame systems, enemy design, PvP, PvE, all of it. If I wanted a 10-hour video, then I would do that, but I know nobody wants to listen to that. So, other than to say the lightweight M4 needs to be brought back in full auto, you know I had to include it, there are two major points that I want to focus on here. The first being the open world. Making the switch from there being relatively empty open world streets and fixed activity points in the Division 1 and 2 to a fully populated city of civilians and enemies with probably much more random encounters and dynamic events would undoubtedly be a lot of work. But if it's possible, and again, I think utilizing next-gen tech, maybe even Ubisoft's own scalar program that they're working on would be essential, but if it's possible, then I think this would be really awesome. Of course, dynamic weather events are a must, maybe even more severe snowstorms and blizzards than what we saw in the Division 1, but to top it all off, I think we should absolutely see the system we recently saw in the Division Resurgence's open beta make its way into the Division 3, which is the ability to run into other players out in the open world, not in the DZ, not for the purposes of PvP, but just seeing other players out in the world who are off doing their own tasks, completing their own objectives, etc. I think this would add a whole new layer of cooperation and excitement to the game, and especially under the context of the ideas I laid out for this open world, imagine you're sifting through a crowd of civilians trying not to get spotted, and then a Black Tusk drone or Warhound spots you. Maybe this would be an all-new type of event where suddenly reinforcements are pouring in and you either have to try and fight or escape. Imagine that's happening, and then another player happens to be at the opposite end of the square off doing their own thing, laying low, and suddenly they see this action going down. Now they have the option to either run away or join in the fight, and let's say that more and more players keep joining, and the event is designed to trigger a boss encounter if enough waves are cleared or enough people are present, and suddenly you have this huge firefight going on in a random location due to a random circumstance. That's just one idea for one event. I think the sheer potential for dynamic encounters in this type of an open world would be phenomenal, and if anybody could do it right, it's Massive and the Division. So that's one core concept I had for the open world of the game, but no surprise here, I also wanted to touch on the Dark Zone. Now, in the last stream for the Division 3 video, I pitched an idea for the Dark Zone that was disconnected that didn't really fit in with the story I was also suggesting. And while I think that idea could still be absolutely cool to see in some project down the line, I would love to play it, I wanted to go back to tradition and pitch one here that was coherent with everything else. Now, I think an important place to start is, lore-wise, would Dark Zones even really be necessary at that point in the Division timeline? I mean, we're talking probably 2 years into the apocalypse at the point at which this game would take place, and the Dark Zones were intended as outbreak quarantine zones, and we even saw in Warlords of New York in the Division 2 that the Dark Zone there had been decommissioned. It got shut down because it was no longer necessary. So I was trying to think what sort of circumstances and setup would replicate that same type of lawless environment, and then I came to this realization. We're in the Black Tusk's headquarters, their home city. They're not going to deal with insubordination or crime or any of that. So what if in this vision of the Division 3, the Dark Zone is this city's prison? Instead of having any sort of justice system or any more of an ethical prison system, when the Black Tusk dislikes something you're doing, they throw you into the Dark Zone, which I imagine by the time we would arrive to this city has just become an absolute madhouse. There are walls around it so people can't escape, maybe even some guards here and there, but the vast amount of the inside of it is unmonitored and completely lawless. I feel like that would be a really cool setup to evolve the intensity of the DZ while still retaining the core concepts of the Dark Zone in such a way that conform to the continued Division lore and story. And of course, its general purpose would be the same, that it's one large area that you can enter into. It's got PvPvE and offers some of the best loot in the game at the highest risk, and so I think that would be pretty cool to see. So like I said, there's a million different topics to cover under the gameplay umbrella, but I thought those two were particularly important to go over. And then as we wrap towards the end of this one, I did want to at least briefly touch on the potential timing of this game, which is of course impossible to accurately predict at this point given the game isn't even confirmed to be coming, although I'm quite sure it will in the future. But one thing that is certain, and as I always feel the need to mention because I see so many people saying, I hope we see it in 2023 or 24, if the Division 3 happens, it is still years away. The only way that's not true is if it were to be developed by a different Ubisoft studio than Massive Entertainment, but I am 99% sure that will not and is not currently happening. It isn't impossible, but I highly doubt it. Now, the one very interesting recent detail here is that Massive recently announced that playtesting will begin in early 2023 for their upcoming Star Wars project, and that Star Wars game is where the vast majority of the Division 1 and 2's old team was transitioned to after Warlords of New York released for the Division 2. Not very many of them are on Avatar. Now, at first, I was like, wow, that's a quick turnaround for them to be doing playtesting. They probably began full development around mid-2020, which in theory is a good amount of time, 2.5 years, but that was also right at the height of the pandemic. Either way, the game seems to be progressing quite well. And I mean, good on them. They're experienced developers at Snowdrop in third-person games by now, and I think all of this is just a great sign that the Star Wars game will launch in 2024. Late 2023 is possible, but I think it would be ambitious. Let's just say 2024. If that's when that game launches, then the question becomes, well, where does that team move to afterwards? Obviously, it wouldn't have to be, but let's just say for the sake of discussion that it would be the Division 3. I think seeing the Division 2 continue on for a few years makes sense, maybe pull off one more expansion if they're able to, and then have the last content for the game finish off around early 2026, I guess, so that the current Division 2 team can merge with that older team for a 2027 release date for the Division 3. That would give them a roughly 3-year development cycle, which was the same as the Division 2, and I know that sounds far off, and maybe there's a chance it could come sooner, but I think that's a realistic timeline at this point. And I know some might question my inclusion of a year gap of content in there. Honestly, though, I think those periods are good. They're healthy. Give us that year break to clean our palates. We'll have the likes of Heartland and Resurgence to keep us busy, and then come back with a new product, a new vision with this reformed team of older vets and newer recruits, and see what we got. At the end of the day, the reality is that none of the things I just pitched in this video will ever see the light of day, but it's fun to talk about and speculate on and theorize, and we'll see what happens down the road. Thank you all so much for watching. Leave a like if you enjoyed this video, and be sure to subscribe with notifications on to keep you updated every time I upload. Let me know your thoughts on this entire discussion, guys. Keep in mind, like I just said, this is all purely for fun. I enjoy talking about theoreticals and future ideas and whatnot. Doesn't mean that any of it is meant to be taken overly seriously or that I'm saying it's going to happen. It's all for fun. With that in mind, do let me know all of your thoughts and reactions here. What do you think about some of the ideas I pitched, and what are your own dreams and ideas for a potential Division 3 game? I'm sure there are going to be tons and tons of comments to sift through, and I can't wait to read each and every one. Once again, Merry Christmas to anybody celebrating. Happy holidays all around. Thank you all for an incredible 2022. You've all given me such a gift with this channel, and bring on 2023. I've still got a few videos coming before the new year, but until then, everybody, once again, thank you all so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day, and until the next one, guys, RogueGold. Ow.